I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please have a seat. Yes, Mr. Marson.
Thanks, sir. Just start by giving us your full name, if you would, please.
It's Tina Azitairani.
Thank you. And if we can have on screen, please, DRI 501. This is your main report to the inquiry. It's dated the 14th of October, but I think that was the date when you confirmed some minor corrections, and you previously provided your report on the 28th of September of this year. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And are the contents of this report true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
And can we have on screen DRI 502, the addendum report, independent expert report you provided to the inquiry? That was dated the 14th of October, responding to some further issues posed on behalf of the inquiry. And are the contents of that second statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. You have been engaged by the inquiry to provide independent expert opinion in your role as a consultant child and adolescent forensic psychiatrist. Can I just deal with your qualifications and background briefly, Doctor, if I may? Can we have on screen, please, page 3 of your main report, first statement? Thank you. You tell us in paragraph 1.2 that you gained your Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery from the University of Mumbai, I think back in 2001, is that
yes.
right? And you have completed specialist training with dual accreditation in child and adolescent psychiatry and in forensic psychiatry from February 2012.
Yes.
And Dr. Rani, I appreciate that it's immediately something that second nature to you, but for those who are not familiar, can you just give an explanation of the difference between forensic psychiatry and general psychiatry?
So a general psychiatrist or a general child and adolescent psychiatrist would not necessarily be familiar with the complexities around the criminal justice system, around more complex risks to others, and that is part of the training. So it's primarily around the criminal justice legislation and mental health and risk. That is the added forensic element of the training.
Thank you. You tell us, by way of your professional background, that since your accreditation, your dual accreditation in 2012, you've worked as a consultant in NHS child and adolescent inpatient and also in community forensic mental health services. It's important that we understand something about the breadth and depth of that experience. So could we just look at page 36, please? And could we have the dates at the top of the page enlarged? Dr. O'Reilly, would you forgive me if I don't ask you about your earlier years in practice up to the specialist registrar stage, but the first of your locum consultant roles you've given there from the 1st of February 2012. Could you just briefly go through each of those posts and just tell the chair in a sentence or two what the nature of the post was and what your exposure to patients was?
So the locum consultant job was in West London Mental Health Services in a medium secure unit. At the time, community forensic CAM services did not really have a true specification through NHS England, but we were providing outreach where different services would commission it. So we did community forensic CAMs on an ad hoc basis, mainly for London services. So that was the extent of medium secure services for adolescents. National services, so unlike adult mental health services where you have low secure, medium secure, and you have high secure like Broadmoor, in the adolescent world we have now low secure and medium secure services, and medium secure is the highest level of security. for young people with mental health difficulties and who have committed a serious offence. So that would be the extent and nature of young people I worked with within that year.
Then I think you moved to Birmingham Solihull.
Yes, so similarly, that was my substantive consultant years. It started off in medium secure services at Ardenley. That included the same clientele. And then also that we also had a similar ad hoc community FCAM services, which would get commissioned on case-by-case basis until the spec became live. And then I was responsible as clinical lead in developing the community forensic CAM services for the West Midlands.
Thank you. And then I think within that same period, I think you moved up in responsibility, is that right, and became clinical lead?
Yes, so it was within that period I became clinical lead for medium secure services, the medium secure adolescent services, community forensic CAM services, and we developed a low secure unit at Ardenley at the time for adolescents.
And then I think you had a change of location then from December 2018 to January 20. Tell us about that consultant post that we see at the top of the page.
Yes, so I moved, and along with that, moved to doing community forensic CAMs and generic community CAMs with Surrey and Borders. And that included doing autism-specific assessment services and complex young people in the community, seeing and supporting complex young people in the community.
Thank you. And then if we can go back, please, to page 35. From January 2020 up until today, can you just describe, I think still in Surrey, your current post?
No, I then moved down to Southampton, and I am now, which it's a new merge trust, but it was Southern Health Foundation NHS Trust. I became consultant psychiatrist in the low secure unit there and clinical lead for low secure, medium secure, and generic adolescent inpatient services. The trust is now merged and is Hampshire Isle of Wight NHS Foundation Trust. I am no longer clinical lead for the general adolescent inpatient or the medium secure services as they branched out.
Thank you. And then if we go back to the main body of your report, please, we've looked at your posts with NHS Trusts and FCAM's post. Paragraph 1.1.4, page 3, please. Can you just summarise briefly for the Chair the national roles that you have held and national posts that you have held?
Yes, I've been with, I was a member of the clinical reference group to NHS England, roughly, I would say, from 2015, and then I became co-chair of the clinical reference group for Tier 4 CAM services. And
what does that do, just in a nutshell?
So the clinical reference group advises NHS England on the service specification development for Tier 4 services that include community forensic CAMs, all inpatient services. This has now changed slightly in the last year or so. But part of that group was to look at our service specification, any data we were gathering, thinking about any restrictive interventions, practices, etc.
Is that looking at the type of services that are to be provided or their quality, or both?
Both.
Thank you. And an elected member, I think, also of the Child and Adolescent Faculty of the Royal College of Psychiatry.
Yes.
And what does that entail?
That, again, was partly my role was to bridge the gap between the clinical reference group and the college in the faculty, but also to think through with the faculty about any pressing needs, or thinking through about what we might, any guidance we might develop, any particular views to be considered or practices to be considered within the faculty.
Thank you. You, at page 4 of your statement, included a section of disclosure of interests, which in one sense was alerting the learned chair to the fact that you may have met some of the clinicians involved in this case because you have national roles. But for our purposes, having given that declaration of interest, I think you were also making clear in your disclosure of interest in terms of your experience that you do have experience both of working in my words, community standard CAMS services as well as community forensic CAMS services. Is that
Yes.
right? And the extent of any dealings that you've had with any clinicians who are involved in this case, I think, is only in the sense of meeting them in a normal way as part of your national role.
Yes.
You don't know them particularly, and you've not discussed the details of this case with them.
No, I haven't.
Thank you. In section 1.3 and 1.4 of your report, we just skip through pages 4, 5, 6, and so on. You set out your instructions. You've set them out in detail. They're there transparently, but I don't need to go through them. In section 1.5 of your report, just bring it up briefly, please, Sarah, page 9. You set out the sources of information that you've used, including the medical records and the witness statements and reports that you've had access to in providing your own report. And again, I don't intend to take you through those, but you've set them out. In section 2, can we look at page 11? You have provided a section on background and issues. And would this be right, that from the very voluminous materials that the inquiry provided you with, and we're grateful for the time that you spent on them, you've sought to distill not every event in a chronology by any means, but some of the key events, some of the key milestones in the history of AAR's dealing particularly with the mental health services?
Yes.
But also looking at some of the risk events that were happening in the community, so for example, the bus incident and a number of others.
Yes, I have.
Thank you. The inquiry has been looking at those with the appropriate witnesses, so I'm not going to run through your overview of them, but we note that you had analysed it and set it out in that way. And then if we can turn to section 3 at page 17, we come to your analysis and findings topic by topic on the issues that you were asked to address. So we see 3.1 risk assessments, and that's the first substantive topic that I'd like to ask you about. So in terms of the adequacy of the CAMS systems and processes, you say at paragraph 3.1.1.1, if that can be highlighted, please, Sarah. It's been noted that CAMS have a risk assessment that was completed on triage, but this is not standardised and did not inform decision-making around intervention, supervision, discharge and transition. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, in relation to that, I'm not going to bring up all of these by any means, but if we look, please, at AHCH 30162, and if we could go to page 2, please. We see for the entry for the 11th of October, at risk of crime, no mental health indicated in referral. That seemed to be all that was said at the initial triage. Would you agree?
Yes.
And then if we could have a look, please, in the same document at page 5 for the 15th of December. We see there urgent partnership. We just pick up with deemed medium to high risk. It's on page 6. This is page 5, Sarah. Thank you. Urgent partnership, deemed medium to high risk to others. 2 clinicians at first assessment may be deemed appropriate. assessed by clinical justice team, open to prevent for radicalisation, referral made for ASD assessment, referral made to forensic cams, assaulted peer with hockey stick, 2 times occasions, carried a knife, discussed 16th, put through, got urgent partnership given complex nature of difficulties. So there is some reference there to risks. But what would your assessment of that be in terms of the detail and quality of that as a risk assessment, bearing in mind the seriousness of the events with which AR had been involved?
That isn't a risk assessment. That just highlights what the concerns were at the time, so that's not necessarily a risk assessment.
Thank you. As we were getting towards the end of events, again, without going through all of those, if we could just have on screen AHCH 30160, please. The Chair is familiar with this, and you may recall this from the time of Miss Morris, and this is the updated assessment for the 23rd of July. And would this be right in summary, that while that does refer to some of the events that had taken place, it didn't include a number of important matters. So the original October 29 incidents of going to school with a knife on 10 occasions, that would clearly be important, and it doesn't seem to have carried through to these sort of assessments towards the very end of the relevant period. Would you agree?
Yes. Again, I think this is more about listing what the risks were.
Yeah.
And this is partly what we tend to do now, but there is a formulation and should be a care plan after.
So this is more a list of some incidents that, would you agree, was not comprehensive and isn't actually analysing and assessing or gradating the risk. It's more a partial list of some events.
Yes.
And as we've seen, although that was the clinical risk tool, when it was then condensed down into the children and young person current view, if we could have AHCH 30159 on screen, please. 6 days before the attack. If we could have the section marked questions 16 to 20 highlighted, please, Sarah. Accepting that this is a one-page type review, poses risk to others, none.
Sorry, what was the
Yeah,
question?
the poses risk to others, none, is the snapshot that's given on this one-page view. And on any view, that I'm sure you'd agree, was wholly inadequate and wrong.
It is inadequate, yes.
Thank you. So if we can go back to your report, please, your main report at page 17. Thank you. And back to the top half of the page, please. When you said that it was not standardised, again, I appreciate it's very familiar to you, but what precisely do you mean by that?
So the latter document in 2024 was a more standardised risk assessment document that we now use across CAMS services. So it's not a forensic CAMS assessment or a structured tool necessarily, but it talks about all the risks, and there should be a formulation at the end and then a plan against it. And that is more a standardised tool that should be used.
So the early ones at triage weren't standardised at all?
No.
But even when standardised tools were being used at the CAMS level, not the more complex forensic CAMS, but what was missing was the formulation at the end leading to a management plan. Thank you. I asked Dr. Killen, the clinical lead, about this and of CAMS, and asked her, is that the standard of risk assessment in terms of the quality and level of detail that you would expect for a case of this seriousness? And she, as the clinical lead, accepted in her answer, no. I think we recognise that the risk management tool was neither filled out comprehensively enough or regularly enough in the record on review, and I would agree that the detail, and especially the updated detail, following the consultation from FCAMS wasn't included, and that would have been beneficial. Would you agree with that concession?
Yes.
And I think you go on to make the point in the same paragraph of your report, 3.1.1.1, no, as it was, please, Sarah, that another difficulty is that such risk assessment as there was at the CAMS level doesn't seem to have informed the decision-making around what intervention, supervision, discharge and transition should take place. Is that right?
Yes.
And was that particularly the case for the latter period, that the early indications of risk in 2019 and 2020 didn't seem to be informing clinical decision-making in 22-23?
Yes. But I think it didn't inform decision-making throughout.
Yes. Thank you. And so if we can go down, Sarah, so that we can see 3.1.1.2 and the sections beneath it, so the second half of the page, please. The point about becoming less clear towards the end, you say, whilst CAMS carried out a risk assessment on triage, and there's some evidence in the raising concerns with the team and other agencies around the risk presented to AR due to the deterioration in his presentation and safeguarding concerns around his parents, this became less clear towards the end of their working relationship with him, with a lack of clarity on who would still be working with him. Is that right?
Yes.
And then in paragraph 3.1.2.2, you say, when working with young people who present a high risk to others, to aid with structured risk assessments, CAMS services will refer the young person for consultation, and if required, direct work with community forensic CAMS services. After the initial referral to community FCAMS services, a re-referral was not made despite a deterioration in his presentation and completion of the autism assessment. Would you agree that the more sophisticated types of risk assessment that were used by FCAMS that we'll come on to, but that the completion of those may not have been within the skill set of many of those working in CAMS?
Absolutely.
And so in that sense, is this right, that both the referral and, if necessary, the re-referral to FCAMS becomes particularly important so that that more sophisticated type of risk assessment can take place?
Yes.
And without being pejorative about that skill set, because they're not specialists in forensic work at all, but would you expect the CAMS service to have an awareness of, in this sense, their own limitations and the importance of obtaining that specialist advice?
Yes. So that's partly why forensic CAMS services got set up nationally.
Thank you. Pausing for one moment and thinking about recommendations for the future, one of the matters I've been asked to explore with you is that might be thought that the complexity of cases presenting to ordinary CAMS is challenging and perhaps increasing. Do you think that there is a need to embed within CAMS their own ability to do the more complex type of risk assessments, or should that remain in the remit of FCAMS?
I think it needs to remain in the remit of FCAMS, primarily because these tasks are they're not simple tasks that could be done at one assessment or one meeting. They require a lot of time. They require the thinking space. And if we asked our generic CAMS colleagues to do this, they won't be able to provide the generic CAMS care that they do provide.
Fine, thank you. So if we can look, please, at page 18 of your report, you go on to deal with the topic at the top, the adequacy of the assessments undertaken in AR's case in relation to the risk that he presents. And at 3.1.3.1, top of the page, I think you make the point that I've just asked you about, that CAMS services in general would not have the skill set to complete the structured risk assessment using structured professional judgments, yes?
Yes.
You then note at 3.3.2 the letter that was sent by FCAMS, and we've explored that both with Mr. Hicklin and with Ms. Brown. I'm not going to go through, therefore, everything that you've set out because it's a document that we've seen before. But this is where we're getting into the realms of the SAVRI. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Can we turn, please, to page 37 within your own report? And can we have the second bullet point, all of the text in the second bullet point enlarged, please, Sarah? I'm sure that you know it by heart, but I put it up on screen if it's a helpful prompt. But could you just explain what is actually involved in a structured assessment of violence risk in youth, the SAVRI?
So the SAVRI is, I've got it here, apologies for the condition it is in, but it's a structured risk assessment tool. And what it actually means, so in risk, if you don't mind me elaborating a bit, you have kind of 3 risk assessment tools, actuarials, which are primarily used by things like insurance companies, where they crunch numbers and tell you that's the potential risk. You then have, within generic risk assessments, we do a kind of clinical, I have a feeling, gut feeling. And both of these are inadequate, and hence there have been developments of structured risk assessment tools. In the adult world, we have what is known as the HCR20. In the adolescent world, for violence, we have the SAVRI. Now, these are tools, the SAVRI in particular has 24 risk items and 6 protective factors that you consider for young people, and the risk particularly of violence towards others. And I think that's really important. So we wouldn't use this otherwise. It has 10 historical factors, which you could consider actuarial factors, 6 social or contextual factors, and 8 individual factors, and then the 6 protective factors. And the way you do it is you code it low, moderate, and high, but really you code it to identify what are critical factors when you're looking at risk. And in order to do this, I mean, there are lots of ways of doing this, and people put numbers or they tick boxes, and that's absolutely not appropriate. What you want is the narrative behind it. You want to be able to collect the data, and this involves, that's why we have big consultation meetings with all agencies, so you capture all the data. You then put it through the risk items that you want to consider. You then want to highlight which one of these are critical factors we need to work with: the system, the young person, and then what do you want to monitor? How long do you want to monitor it for? And what are you looking to achieve? Doing a document like this means the risk remains live. So even if the risk reduces, you've got factors in there that you might think, actually, if this changes, I need to start getting worried about the risk. So, for example, I guess with AR in particular, if the SAVRI had been completed and in that was highlighted that isolating himself is quite a significant factor because he accesses the internet and is likely to explore factors. That would have come out in doing a SAVRI. And then he hasn't been doing it for X, Y, and Z years, all going really well. If he started doing it, which he had, he'd been isolating himself. That's when you'd have started getting worried and thought, do we need to do something else? So that is why a risk assessment or a structured risk assessment tool would help with thinking about risk over time.
Thank you. and it may be an almost painfully obvious example. But in AR's case, further incidents of carrying a knife, particularly outside of the home, would have been clearly flagged up, one presumes, as a very serious indication of a further increase in risk.
Yes, so one of the first factors is previous history of violence is probably the best indicator of future risk of violence, and that would have been captured in it. So the more amounts, the higher amounts of incidents you have, the higher your risk. Well, not higher your risk is, it becomes more live.
Yeah. And the process involved your 24 risk items, 10 of which are historical, 6 of which are social contextual, 8 individual, 6 protective factors. That's going to require, in order for the tool to be effective, a lot of information to be gathered from all of the relevant agencies. Would that be fair?
Yes, so what you do is you dig. You start looking for the information, you get in touch with all the relevant bodies, so whoever's been involved or whoever might be involved, you collect the data, you organize a consultation meeting to meet with everybody. If you identify gaps, you wait to get more of that information, and then you pull it together.
Can you give us, I don't suppose there is a standard time, tell us if there is, but can you give us an indication of how long the process of information gathering and then completing the tool for the first time takes?
It's extremely difficult to say because it depends on how long agencies take to get your information. Then getting the consultation group together, because that's really relevant. Everybody needs to hear about what we're thinking about together. You then need time to write it up, and that depends on your administrative support that you have, etc. But once you've got the information, it's about 2 weeks to pull it all together, and then you ideally would arrange a further consultation with the same group, or if you think other people need to be invited, invite them. Ideally, you'd want, so it's not always necessary, but ideally you'd want to meet the young person and the parents to gather some of their views that are required, but that could be done with a third party who was engaged with the young person.
So a process of some weeks and probably a small number of months?
Yes.
Thank you. So if we can go back, please, to paragraph 3.1.3.2 on page 18. Page 18. We can see that what Mr. Hicklin did was to send out a letter noting that risk assessment would be complicated by the likely diagnosis of autism, and referring to aspects of young people with an autism diagnosis should be taken into account when considering the risk. Now, that list of information that was factors that should be taken into account when considering the risk, was that reasonably helpful so far as it went?
Yes, it would have been if somebody would have read it.
Would you, however, suggest that FCAMS should have gone further and taken the lead in drawing together the information and conducting the Savary type of risk assessment?
Yes.
Because
that's primarily what our function as community FCAM services has been. So we always had a lead service that gets in touch with us. We then help coordinate the risk assessment and then hand over the work that might be required to the others as part of that system. In rare cases, we might do direct work with them, but that's in very rare cases. But the majority of the work around the risk assessment, the lead is taken via by FCAMS, but with whoever's referred into them.
Thank you. And so instead giving some more high-level advice as to risk factors, and it must be said in fairness also indicating that practitioners could come back and re-refer, would it be fair to say that there was a degree of abrogation of responsibility at that stage by FCAMs in not fully fulfilling the role that they should have played?
I think from what, from the spec and how we would practice, it is definitely not in keeping.
Thank you. And the benefit of the structured risk assessment being done, perhaps some aspects of that are an obvious inference from what you've said, but would you agree that it is going to help define and inform the type of interventions that should take place?
Intervention and management, yes.
And I'm going to come on to management, but in the management, it would also give a careful indication of what needs to be monitored, yes?
Yes.
Or signs that things are moving in the right direction, or the converse, that they're going worse, and that further intervention or more robust intervention may be required.
Yes. So even through the consultation process, it's lovely to have the list, but what would have been even more helpful is how could this be addressed? And I think that's part of the risk assessment. A detailed risk assessment helps you identify what needs to be addressed and how to address it. So, for example, in this list, if you're talking about disruption in routines and lack of motivation to change, who would be doing this? What would they be doing with this information? Where would the support lie? Those things would have to be clarified as part of that plan.
Thank you. And so if we look at page 19 of your report, 3.1.3.4, dealing with the benefits, ensures the risk is described clearly, helps identify who is meant to review it, ensures smart actions are considered, which include interventions with the young person, family and wider systems. So all of those are benefits. And when you say it helps identify who is meant to review it, might it then have been that either CAMS or potentially the youth offending team, that they might have had responsibility then for keeping it under review?
Yes, it could be any of the services, so including social care, rarely, but if the police were leading on it, the police, anybody else would probably continue. And if they needed to come back to FCAMS, they would.
Thank you. And I don't suppose that you're able to put a calendar date on it and when it should have been completed. But should we understand from your evidence that the detailed work involved in the Savary should have been being undertaken in the early months of 2020?
Yes, sooner rather than later.
Are you able to help us? And of course, I'm going to ask you a number of counterfactuals, appreciating that they're hypothetical. So if we get into the stage where you don't feel comfortable giving an answer because you think it's too speculative, you must say so, Doctor. But are you able to help us with what the Savary would have indicated in relation to, first of all, the level of risk, and secondly, as to particular matters that ought to be looked out for?
So, without going into full detail of the Savary, it's going to be rather tricky to highlight each and every factor, but are you okay with me referencing?
Yes, of course.
What isn't helpful is the low, medium, high risk, but people often want that. At the onset, given that it was prior to any interventions, he would have been considered high risk. But actually, every one of those factors, you want to think about low, medium, and high. So, for example, I wouldn't go through his historical factors because they remain static. But if you were to think about his social or contextual factors in the Savary, for example, peer rejection, his perception of being rejected by his peers would have come up as quite high. So what you would have indicated is focusing some work around that aspect for him to work through it to see if the risk would reduce moving forward. Similarly, with regards to his individual factors, there is negative attitudes or, for example, poor compliance. So initially, I think poor compliance is a good one to look for with regards to him. Initially, he had relatively good compliance. He engaged with all the services. He was attending education. He attended the psychiatry appointments. But that would have been a critical factor to keep an eye on, because as he became non-compliant, that would have an impact on his risk. So even though he wouldn't have necessarily scored high risk at the time, that would have been a critical factor. So even if you score low, those can still be critical factors to continue monitoring.
Thank you. Going back, putting the counterfactual to one side, in circumstances where the SAVRI had not been completed, or a similar tool had not been completed, would you have expected FCAMS to keep the referral open until the autism diagnosis had been made?
Apologies, I will have to expand on that a bit, because I don't think the autism diagnosis should have been the deterring factor to complete the assessment. However, what would have been really helpful is to identify, even if they didn't, so as part of just the consultation process, often when FCAMS consults to a group or a system, they advise on matters such as were in Mr. Hickley's note, but clearly indicating who would do what and ensuring that they had a process of following up. So whether the autism diagnosis happened or not is rather irrelevant. It's ensuring that there was a process for things to be acted on, reviewed, and followed up.
Thank you. And when you say that the autism diagnosis is rather irrelevant, is that in part because those who were dealing, not just clinicians, but in education, those who were dealing with AR had already picked up that autistic traits, and they were already factoring that in some sense?
Yes, so I guess we've had a massive increase in young people now being diagnosed, young people, adults being diagnosed with autism, and actually we are encouraged, and have been encouraged for a while, to look at young people with a neurodivergent lens. So you make adaptations, you work through with that lens with most young people, at least we do in my service. And appreciate right at the beginning that might not be the case. But from a forensic CAMS perspective, we've always worked with young people with different needs. And irrelevant of those, you did the work you needed to do around the risk.
Thank you. Ms. Brown accepted that at the time there wasn't a mechanism in place by which FCAMS pulled the case back in, so they didn't have something that would trigger their further involvement when the diagnosis came in, and she says that that's something that they do have now. Can you just help with that? At the time, early 2020, nationwide, did FCAMS have systems, in your experience, if they discharged a case, to have some means by which they diarised to check in the future that other agencies had done what they said they were going to do?
Not really, unless you had a follow-up appointment. So good practice would say we would have reviewed it 3 months, 6 months to say, is everybody doing what they are meant to do, and do you need any support, and are you okay with us closing the case?
And I'm asked to explore with you whether you might accept that the fact that FCAMS had in fact discharged AR from their service without a standardised risk assessment being completed, whether that carried a risk that other agencies might take some false comfort or reassurance from those facts. In other words, FCAMS weren't unduly troubled.
I think what's happened is the actual letter was lost in translation. And so, yes, a structured risk assessment would have helped, but ensuring everybody had the letter and the information in the letter would have probably meant that it wouldn't have been dismissed or services wouldn't have been reassured in the way they were.
Thank you. Go back to your report, please. Page 19. You say there in the middle of the page, 3.1.3.5, combining the two aspects of CAMS and FCAMS together, the assessments undertaken in AR's case by CAMS or community FCAMS in relation to the risks he presented with and or any safeguarding concerns were not adequate. Is that right?
Yes.
And would you agree in general terms that as a result of that, what ended up happening was that CAMS focused, especially in the later years, in 22, 23 and 24, on the risks to AR and not enough on the risks that AR posed to others?
Yes.
Thank you. And just keep on the lower half of what's already on the screen that Sarah's helpfully put up. You say in 3.1.41, as to the appropriateness of the levels of the risk that was identified, because the initial risk assessment was not adequate and an adequate tool was not used, an appropriate level of risk towards others was not identified, this was then not reviewed either with AR or his parents. And the point that I've just touched on, latterly the focus of CAMS services was around his anxiety symptoms, school refusal. There was no mention of his historical risk or review of what he was doing on his computer or how he actually felt about school.
Yes.
And so those early indications of risk, would it be fair to say that to a significant extent they got lost?
Yes.
Can I ask you if you can help us with this? You've said that the low, medium, high is not entirely helpful, and it's more important to be more structured, to have narrative and to look at clinical, critical indicators, even if something is low or medium, if this changes, it goes to high. Against all of those explanations, I'm still asked to explore with you if the indications in the SAVRI had indicated areas where there was high risk, what the actual interventions should have looked like.
So depending on what the area was, so if, again, just giving examples, but they would be different for different bits. If there was the issue around low interest or commitment to school, which is one of the factors, then you'd want to look at how, so he was having reviews, but you'd want to think about how could we improve that, because I think there were comments made about him not liking a particular teacher, but actually exploring this further with him would have been one of the things you'd want to think about. Exploring at school, I know he had a welfare check officer, but what were they doing other than checking in on him? And this would have informed what they did. If it was the issue around poor compliance, actually, if you saw the pattern of poor compliance with medication, but also engagement, so poor compliance is just not medication, but engagement and other services, then you'd want to think about how you're going to optimize it, how would that need to shift, who would you bring in to support with that, other than it, so from a medical point of view, if you refuse medication and we did not see the role for medication, that was fine, we'd stop it. But were there other interventions that were needed for him to see people, to go to education, etc., what would we do around that would be more, that would be indicated and would be worked on. Just thinking through the ones here, the other one is around strong, a positive factor would have been strong social support. Now, what we knew is he did not, when he was in education, he actually did have positive relationships with his teachers right at the beginning. That fell by the by. And actually, what was his social support other than his parents? And we would have questioned that. You would have might have wanted to introduce somebody into that to reduce that risk and to increase that protective factor. So that is how the risk assessment would have worked. Does that make sense?
I follow. Thank you. would it, just thinking about sort of multi-agency options, would it have led, do you think, to a recognition of the need to be routine multi-agency meetings that included review of the risk?
Yes, to begin with, and when risk changed.
And so, again, something like the bus incident, if there'd been frequent multi-agency meetings to start off with and they become less frequent, that would have obviously been a trigger for the need for one to be held.
Absolutely.
And presumably those could also have kept under review need for further referrals to prevent, potentially.
Prevent, forensic cams,
Yeah.
the police.
Thank you. And with a constant eye to who the lead authority, lead agency was.
Yes.
On the mental health side, were there any specialist interventions that could have been considered around violence fascination?
This is quite a grey area, really, because it's not really, I mean, often it's a piece of work that psychologists do, but it doesn't necessarily sit within the mental health domain. So it could be forensic psychologists, it could be some forensic cam services, but it's not always sat within mental health services. And so it is rather a tricky one about where it sits, and I think that is part of the problem.
And you'll forgive me if my terms are too simplistic, but is that partly because clinical psychological intervention would more normally be linked to the concept of treatable mental health disorders?
Not necessarily. If somebody had an obsession and it sat within well, you could argue that, I guess. You could say that.
And certainly in terms of, as things stand at the moment, any commissioned and funded service, is it easy to identify where that sits in the current makeup, that type of intervention for violence-fascinated individuals who may not have a mental health disorder at the same time?
Yes, if they've been charged and convicted, and there are resources within the criminal justice system, but currently without that, there aren't.
And turning from the mental health side to local authority side, the use of child protection measures and the higher level of forms of interventions that might be permitted by local authorities with child protection, those also presumably could have been kept under review.
Yes, definitely.
And together with that, whether it was called a management plan or a safeguarding plan, would you have expected that sort of good practice to have a clear, smart, compliant management plan of who is doing what?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to turn next, please, or perhaps I should just pause there. Is there anything else in terms of risk assessment that you think I haven't covered that you would wish to add?
I just wanted to be clear that not every young person needs an extensive risk assessment, but where there are indicators,
Yes.
it should be completed.
Thank you. But AR clearly fell within that
Yes.
category by some margin.
Yes.
Thank you. And then section 3.2 of your report, please, dealt with the question of the escalation of concerns in relation both to risks and safeguarding issues. If we start with page 20, please, of your report. You start off by noting that, in your opinion, the Criminal Justice Liaison and Diversion Team appropriately raised concerns, and the risks they are presented with in 2019 were alerted to. However, their role was temporary, and after raising concerns in the initial period of consultation, they were no longer involved. Is that right?
Yes.
Should they have remained involved in your view?
Not really.
So it's appropriate that they flag it up and to the more appropriate agencies?
That's their role, really.
Thank you. And then when CAMS became involved, next paragraph, they were focused on physical and mental health. They did escalate physical health concerns and made recommendations for dietetic input and input from the eating disorder services. And I don't think in relation to that side of things, you raise in your report any particular concerns.
No.
Thank you. And then you note the next paragraph, they did raise concerns when AR went missing, but there was little in the way of an action plan to address the reasons why he'd gone missing, to challenge the rationale for why he wasn't processed through the criminal justice system. And at the time, the police were of the opinion that he had severe autism and it would not be appropriate for him to be processed. Now, there's quite a lot there, in some senses, to unpick. But can you just explain in the first instance why you particularly alight on the police perception that AR had severe autism? And this may perhaps bring in concepts of high-functioning autism and the differences in the autism spectrum.
So I think it's really important that we recognize that autism is a social communication difficulty. I think a lot of people have made reference to it earlier, so I won't repeat that. But when you've got a normal intellect and you have autism, often what you need is adaptations to the processes around you. But you have a good understanding of what is right and wrong. You understand that things have a negative impact on others, and hence it does not mitigate you from going through the court process. So when the comment has been made on severe autism, I don't think there are grades of autism necessarily. You have to take it in the context of somebody's ability to function and understand processes out with their neurodiversity. And he had that. So the question around severe autism was something that clinicians should have asked and challenged.
And it matter for the chair in due course, but it may be suggested that the evidence would indicate, as regards the police, that they wrongly assumed a lack of capacity without clinical opinion. But should we take it from the comments you've just given that you think there was a shortcoming in the other agencies who, having been informed of this, didn't challenge that and ask, why isn't this going through criminal justice?
I think it's prior to that as well, that they didn't actually ask the questions around what was it that led to the police being involved, at least the details of that. And following on from that, then challenging actually who made that decision. Because as far as I understand from the records, no clinician was consulted on that decision-making process.
Yes. And if such consultation had taken place, please correct me if I'm wrong, but should we understand from the tenor of your evidence that the advice that would have gone back would have been that AR's own individual autism would not have meant that he lacked responsibility for his own actions in carrying a knife in public?
Yes, or going through the criminal justice system.
Yeah. And we've explored with others the counterfactual in relation to that. But as you may have picked up from the evidence, one possibility in relation to that is that if a search had been carried out at that time, it's known that AR had purchased ricin seeds and had purchased chemical equipment, so filters and flasks and scales and so on, and may have had them hidden under his bed at that stage. And if that was searched for and appreciated, obviously there'd be a whole spectrum of what may happen in criminal justice terms, but that would have immediately caused a very significant FCAM's involvement and reappraisal of risk.
It would have, or he would have been at that point also been put in custody.
Yeah. So, as I say,
Yeah.
a whole panoply of what may have happened in criminal justice terms, custody, and may also have been an issue about what may have been found on his computers. But in addition, there would then have been FCAM's involvement really at a much higher level.
Absolutely.
Thank you. In 3.2.1.4, you cite the internal review from all the Hayes conclusions of the occasions when AR's care may have been appropriate to have sought safeguarding supervision, so missed opportunities in relation to that. Did you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
And then where it goes, I think, in your conclusion at 3.2.2.1 over the page, AR was out with parental control. He'd been presenting a risk in the family home. He was withdrawn and spending considerable periods of time on his computer. He was not looking after himself. He hadn't showered for more than a month. Right back in September 23, when reviewing his attendance and parents' inability to make him engage, these should have been escalated through safeguarding. So just pausing there, the escalation through safeguarding, just briefly explain that process, what that would have looked like.
Well, it depends on everybody's local process, but you'd get in touch with your safeguarding lead to raise concerns, particularly as there were concerns around his mental health and being out of parental control and presenting a risk to the family home. And I appreciate different clinicians had different information, but you'd raise that with your safeguarding lead. You'd consider what the escalation process might be. In his case, social care were involved, so you'd probably liaise with them and raise your concerns through that process. Obviously, not being directly clinically involved with him, it's difficult for me to say, but if I was concerned about somebody becoming more withdrawn and to the stage of not showering for a month, that would make me wonder whether there was anything else undergoing, whether he was having a psychotic process. Bearing in mind, right at the onset, that was one of the questions the liaison diversion team raised. So he, even with young people often who are neurodiverse are also at risk of developing psychotic illnesses. So I would have been concerned. I would have been concerned, is he depressed? And so raising this through safeguarding processes through the service with social care that was involved at the time, and then having some consideration about whether we do a mental health act assessment or not.
Right. So I'm going to come on to the mental health aspect, but if we think about that raising of concerns in that level, perhaps having two limbs, one would be to CAMS, to Alder Hayes safeguarding, then liaising with the local authority, potentially for intensification or raising of the level of involvement of social care, yes?
Yes.
But I think you're indicating, as you go on to talk about in 3.2.2.1, being unable to meet with him, consideration should have been given to carrying out a Mental Health Act assessment as well, for the reasons you've indicated.
Yes.
Now, can I come on to looking at that then, the Mental Health Act assessment in a little bit more detail? Could we also look in this context at what you say about this in page 23 of your report? It's 3.3.4.3 at the bottom of the page, please, Sarah, penultimate paragraph. In my opinion, given his historic risks and the deterioration in his presentation, this should have prompted a Mental Health Act assessment. It's likely that there would be no evidence to suggest he needed treatment in hospital, but it would have given an opportunity to assess him face-to-face and assess his risk to self and others with him. In my opinion, if the above had been considered early in September 23, and he was then discharged with a clear escalation in safeguarding concerns to social services, then that would have been more appropriate rather than his care remaining open for as long as it did without him being seen or the risk being assessed. So there's quite a lot again there to unpick, but if we look at 3.3.4.3, I think you're going a little bit further than in your earlier paragraph, because you're saying here not only should consideration have been given to whether to do a Mental Health Act assessment, but you think that it should have prompted attempting a Mental Health Act assessment. Is that right?
Yes, so this is given knowing his historic risks
Yes.
and the deterioration, yes.
And we appreciate, of course, that as they've dealt with in their own evidence, we've asked Dr. Ram and Dr. Molyneux about their levels of knowledge, but for these purposes, we're assuming that the psychiatrists dealing with AR had the full picture of historical risks. So, dealing with this aspect of your opinion that a Mental Health Act assessment should have been attempted, can I ask you this? What would the threshold tests be? What would a clinician have to be satisfied of, not to actually sign off on the use of a section power, but what would they need to be satisfied of to decide to attempt a Mental Health Act assessment?
So I'm just going to clarify a few things. So somebody with autism or even conduct disorder, neither of those factors in themselves would be detainable factors under the Mental Health Act. I would not consider detaining anybody under those. However, both of those factors, or even if you just considered somebody with neurodiversity, they are at higher risk of developing severe anxiety, depression, and or psychosis. Now, when the pattern changed, then those were the concerns that would have prompted the need for an assessment. Is this young, I haven't seen the young person, is this young person becoming clinically depressed and hence not looking after himself and hence needing treatment in hospital, given that he's non-compliant? Is he becoming psychotic, paranoid, and more reclusive, et cetera, would have prompted the need for that assessment. So not the primary diagnosis of either autism or conduct disorder, but the change in pattern, which meant somebody couldn't see him, and the worry around escalation and risks if I knew the historic risks.
Thank you. So would this be fair that moving away from AR's individual case, if a young person was isolating and refusing to see mental health clinicians, but was reported by parents to be physically well enough, that in itself, absent the historic risk factors in AR's case, wouldn't call for a Mental Health Act assessment?
If there weren't historical risk factors, a lot of people post-COVID did isolate themselves increasingly. I think we're going to see the outcome of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean a Mental Health Act assessment would have been triggered.
Thank you. But in AR's case, you think that it legitimately could have been?
Particularly around the self-care, the change in his pattern. Picking up the fact that he was getting more aggressive in the family home. We were worried about parents' compliance and whether they were actually engaging with services or reporting the right things, yes.
Do you go so far as to say that it should have been, or just that it's a Mental Health Act assessment was an option that should have been considered? But
it should have been considered.
Would there be a spectrum of views amongst different psychiatrists as to whether a Mental Health Act assessment should have been attempted in these circumstances?
Absolutely, particularly now as the threshold has become even higher.
All right. So where it lands in your view is this: you think it would have been legitimate to attempt a Mental Health Act assessment, yes?
Yes.
Not on the basis of a concern of autism or conduct disorder in itself, but that the isolation against the background of other risk factors gave enough concern about psychosis or depression having developed that it was appropriate to attempt?
Yes, the question around that, yes.
But you would accept that responsible other clinicians might have taken a different view.
Absolutely.
You're not saying that this was, to put it in the vernacular, a barn door case for doing a Mental Health Act assessment?
No, it isn't.
Are there, obviously there's clear criteria in the Act itself for when the test for assessment section 2 or treatment section 3 is met. But are there actually specified criteria for whether you attempt a Mental Health Act assessment, or is that more judgmental?
It's more judgmental, so you should have suspicion or think or worry about them having a mental disorder that will need at least an assessment, particularly under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act. So particularly in cases where you're concerned, that's where you might think of initiating a Mental Health Act assessment for that purpose.
I'm asked to explore with you this line of thinking or argument. In thinking about whether you've got grounds to suspect that there is a mental health condition that might need at least assessment, if not treatment, should a clinician really be linking to the likelihood that somebody may need to be detained for assessment or treatment?
Yes, and this should also be linked to either risk to self or others.
So the risk of harm to self or others would be a factor within that?
Yes.
You say in the passage that we've got on screen that it's likely that there would be no evidence to suggest that he needed treatment in hospital. I suppose the challenge might be this: if the clinicians were thinking, well, we have seen him previously and we don't think that there is further treatment that could be given that would be required in hospital, that in a sense you might be going outside at least the spirit of the Act, if not using the powers for an extraneous reason, really to get eyes on him. What do you say about that?
So I completely agree with that. If they had put eyes on him to determine whether he was in fact well enough. So my comment on whether there would be no evidence to suggest he needed treatment is based on the fact that he did latterly have a Mental Health Act assessment after the index offence, which they concluded that he did not require treatment in hospital. So that was what I based it on. However, at the time when he was isolating himself, hadn't been seen by clinicians, there were concerns about compliance both from him and parents. That was not clear then. And so triggering the Mental Health Act assessment at the time, we would not have known whether he had a diagnosis and whether he needed treatment or not.
But just to press you a little bit further on this, it might be thought that the cohort of psychiatrists who wouldn't be in favour of a Mental Health Act assessment here would say, realistically, although we haven't seen him recently, he has had a lot of contact, and we don't think he has a mental disorder, and therefore we don't think that when we do get to see him, it's likely that he will in fact need to be detained in hospital, whether for assessment or for treatment. And so we're uncomfortable with even going to a Mental Health Act assessment, because it seems to be using the Mental Health Act for the purposes of getting eyes on the patient rather than for the legitimate purposes of the Act towards potentially detention for the purposes of assessment or treatment.
I do agree with that cohort of consultants. However, at the same time, we have young people with similar presentations detained in hospital because they were assessed, because they'd been withdrawn, and because people were worried that they might be depressed or not engaging. So there are young people with a similar presentation in hospital detained under the Mental Health Act. And I guess the issue with AR was the risk.
So the risk
that detained for assessment?
Assessment and now treatment.
Sorry, Mr. Nutt.
Sure. And to the extent, therefore, that this may be a difficult area because you've indicated that responsible clinicians could take a different view. Thinking about the future and recommendations, is this on the one hand an area where there needs to be recalibration or further guidance on circumstances in which a Mental Health Act assessment could legitimately be done, or is there potentially a gap in the legislation?
I think there's potentially a gap in the legislation to allow us to see and assess young people better in the community. I'm not convinced all of those who are in hospital currently need to be in hospital, so that's a different discussion for a different day. But saying that, there is nothing else that means these young people can be supported or reviewed more appropriately in the community.
And are you able to help us with what the nature of a solution might be to that, bearing in mind the obvious need for caution in this if it's any sort of compulsive power, but what would that look like, a power effectively to be able to get eyes on somebody, particularly under the age of 18? Would that be with parental consent or even absent parental consent?
Well, I think it's about with parental consent, yes, that's really important. But in cases where you're wondering or you're worried about parents' own capacity, as it was in this case, you would want some way to be able to see a young person. Now, some clinicians might have nipped up to the bedroom and gone, "Excuse me, hello, how are you doing?" and pop their head in, and others won't. And actually, the person who does pop in would have been criticized, or there would have been concerns raised. So I think you need some legislative framework that allows for clinicians or other statute bodies to be able to clap eyes on a young person in a similar situation.
Thank you. Appreciate that this is something that has certainly progressed since at the early stages of AR's involvement with mental health services, but the care, education and treatment review process, can you just explain what that is, first of all, and whether that might have been an appropriate route?
The care education review process was triggered by the Winterborn inquiry a few years back, and the care of adults, young people with learning disability and autism in health situations where the practice was rather poor. That then developed to it be required before somebody is considered or is being admitted to hospital. Having said that, ideally it should always happen for young people or adults before hospital admission is even being considered, but that's not always the case. But in this case, given his diagnosis of autism, if you were thinking about the Mental Health Act and the admission process, you would start thinking about the CETR process.
And just briefly, what would that process have involved?
That would have involved getting to review whether any other alternatives could be put in place before considering admission to hospital. It's not statute, it has no powers. It could include having a befriender, it could include somebody popping in and doing X, Y, and Z. But if AR refused to see the person, there would be no statute power for that process to mean he was being seen. And I'd be happy for somebody to correct me, but I am not sure it holds any statute power as of yet.
Thank you. But is that principally aimed at those in the community who have a diagnosis of autism, where the concern is that aspects around the autism might end up leading to detention?
Yes, autism and or learning disability.
Thank you. So I wonder if that might be a convenient moment for a mid-morning break. I'm turning to the next topic.
Certainly would. We'll sit again at 25:02. Thank you, Mr. Moss.
Thanks, sir. So, Dr. Irani, I'm turning to my next topic, which is diagnosis and treatment. Page 21 of your statement, please, section 3.3. Again, although it may be second nature to you, starting at a very basic level, I'm asked to just explore why it's important to get the diagnosis and all diagnoses correct. Would you agree that, first of all, the diagnosis is important because it informs an understanding of the condition for both the patient and for clinicians treating the patient.
Yes, it's patients, families.
Secondly, it's important because it informs the treatment options. So if it's a condition that's capable of being cured, if it's capable of being ameliorated, it's important that the diagnosis is right so the correct treatments can be provided.
Yes.
Thirdly, the diagnosis can be important for others, non-clinicians, you've touched on some already, for family, but also for other agencies who are dealing with the patient who may need to make appropriate adjustments depending upon the diagnosis. Would
Absolutely.
that be fair?
Yes.
And fourthly, diagnosis can be important and very relevant to risks to selves, risks to others.
Yes.
Are there any other key respects in which the diagnosis is particularly important?
Not really.
Thank you. So you set out in your report in relation to diagnosis at 3.3.1.1 that AR was initially diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And I think you agree with that diagnosis, yes?
Yes.
Just briefly, it's been accepted by the Autism Service that there was some delay in that diagnosis. Trying to summarise quite a lot of evidence shortly, the national average time to reach a diagnosis in autism was quite lengthy, but the local service did accept that their own average waiting time to first assessment, which was 11 weeks, was very significantly exceeded, 45 weeks, and that can't be completely explained by COVID. Because one would have expected the first assessment to have taken place by mid-November 2019. So a delay of some 7 months before the first assessment. It was also accepted that although autism wouldn't in any sense get worse in itself caused by delay, that it could nevertheless be deleterious to have that delay in a diagnosis of autism. Would you agree?
Probably in the way of informing services, but like I say, most services should be working towards an autism-informed lens. So it's rather, so for example, education, etc., should be working with the notion that the approach should be similar for all young people. And hence, I don't necessarily think the delay was critical in this case.
No. But some concern in terms of the supportive measures to help adaptations and to assist AR and his family in ways to make allowance for his condition and understand it, the sooner that is recognised in general terms, the better.
Yes, and that is unfortunately what is required for any kind of SEND support to be put in place.
Thank you. I want to ask you about a different aspect, ADHD. And I think you'll be aware from the documents that AR, when he was first referred by his GP for consideration for autism, that ADHD was also raised. And we heard evidence on this also from Ms. Boggan, the lead for the service, and she accepted that there were 5 occasions across quite a span of time when the referral for ADHD could have been better progressed and it wasn't. She also accepted that there was enough information of concern in terms of behaviours and signs to conclude that AR should have gone for a full ADHD assessment. And it's common ground that that did not happen for AR at any time up to the dreadful events of July of 2024. She also said, though, that she couldn't say what the outcome of a full ADHD assessment would have been, whether the diagnosis would have been made of ADHD as well as the established diagnosis of autism. And she accepted that the failures to take forward the ADHD were indeed shortcomings in the service that was provided. Presumably you would agree with that based on that concession.
If that's her concession, yes.
On the materials that you have seen, would you be able to give an opinion as to whether or not you think a diagnosis of ADHD would have made on a full assessment, or is it not possible to say?
Apologies.
Would you be able to express a view on whether it's likely that a diagnosis of ADHD would have been made when a full assessment was carried out? Or is it not possible to say?
It's not possible to say, but equally, I think he was so withdrawn from so many different things, it would have been difficult to assess, and it overlapped with his autism presentation at the time.
Thank you. In relation to, and again, you should say if this is not an area that you feel appropriate for you to deal with, but in the area of the potential medications that could have been given for ADHD, it presumably follows that you're not able to say whether, even with a diagnosis, whether they would have been appropriate in his case.
If he had a diagnosis, they might have helped, but they wouldn't have mitigated the risk.
And why do you say that they wouldn't have mitigated the risk?
Because his risks weren't related to his ADHD. So he wasn't, for example, the Savary has a particular factor around that. So if you impulsively stand up and hit somebody in the face, that's an impulsivity associated maybe with ADHD. But if you're able to plan and do things in a planned manner, that's less likely to be related to ADHD. And hence, the intervention for ADHD would have had no impact on that risk. In fact, arguably, not saying that's the case, you might be better able to plan what you want to do.
Thank you. And when you consider the report of the October 29, so taking a knife in the bag to school on 10 occasions and the hockey stick incident and going on the bus, those occasions, would you see in that a degree in planning in all of those?
Yes.
What about some of the incidents in the home? Were not some of the incidents of violence in the home more impulsive?
Well, it depends on what lens you look at it with. But if it was sensory or because he felt provoked, then they wouldn't necessarily be impulsive. They would be a response to be boundaries being placed or not agreeing with something that was said to him, and that's not the same thing as impulsivity.
Thank you. In terms of conduct disorder, thirdly, you have considered, I think, whether AR would have met the diagnostic criteria for conduct disorder. So looking at 3.3.1.2, you say further, he had a history of repetitive and persistent pattern of behaviour in which the basic rights of others and major age-appropriate societal norms, rules or laws are violated, such as aggression towards people, destruction of property, deceitfulness and serious violations of rules which predated his first contact with CAMS. In line with the World Health Organization ICD 11th edition, he would meet the criteria for diagnosis of conduct dissocial disorder. Is that right?
Yes.
And sir, for your note, we don't necessarily need to look it up. But page 38 of Dr. Irani's report copies across the key aspects of ICD 11.
That's very helpful.
We've seen that there was a questionnaire that AR's mother, I'm not going to bring it up on screen, but AR's mother completed, giving percentiles for certain aspects of behaviour. And I think that both in relation to one of those for conduct and one of the others related to aggressive behaviours, they were in the high 90s percentiles. They changed slightly for each of those. Would that be consistent with conduct disorder?
Yes.
Some of those refer to the need, if they are in those higher percentiles, to refer to the alternative classification of DSM. Is there any significant difference here that we should be concerned with between DSM and ICD for
Not
conduct
really.
disorder? No?
Not really.
So in relation to a diagnosis of conduct disorder, at what stage in the chronology do you think that that diagnosis could have been made? And if later, when do you think it definitely should have been made?
I think that's a diagnosis that would have probably be made really early on. But I guess what happens is clinicians focus on where they feel they can support or intervene with a young person. And in AR's case, his autism was what was primarily at the forefront of everybody's mind. Conduct disorder and autism can coexist. It's not that one means you can't have the other. Conduct disorder is primarily a cluster of symptoms or behaviors, for a better one of a word. And so that diagnosis, right at the onset, when he first presented, when there were concerns, when he did go through the criminal justice system, is where it would have been best made. But because the focus was around the autism and all the behaviors that were present were attributed to the autism, conduct disorder wasn't being considered.
And do you think that that was a failure of CAMS to consider it? We'll come on to what the counterfactual may have been, but in terms of making an accurate diagnosis, do you think that they really should have considered that and failed to do so?
Not really, because it wouldn't necessarily have affected what they were providing at the time and what AR was engaged in, including parents doing the Parent 2000, etc.
One understands in terms of causation, so what difference it would have made, but if one is looking at it in terms of the duty on treating mental health practitioners to make an accurate diagnosis, do you think that they should in fact have considered this and made this diagnosis, even if it wouldn't have made a difference to interventions?
I would. Would all other CLAMS clinicians necessarily do that? I'm not sure.
Would FCAMS have had a role in this regard? Was conduct disorder something which the specialist teams at FCAMS may have been more familiar or more attuned to?
Probably.
And we've touched on it already, but you've indicated that in terms of where this may have led, please stop me if my summary is too simplistic, but the actual interventions and what was needed with family and other agencies seeking to assist AR would not have been any different with conduct disorder.
Not at the time.
So if we go to the top of the next page, please, Sarah. You say a diagnosis of conduct disorder can be made by any CAMS clinician and does not rely on forensic CAMS services. Is that right?
Yes.
But should we add to that forensic CAMS services may have played a part in helping make the diagnosis?
Yes. Can I expand a bit on this? Because
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. Conduct disorder is quite a stigmatizing diagnosis, like we would say personality disorder. So these are two diagnoses most clinicians don't want to make. And hence the hesitation from my part. But I think it's relevant that in cases where there is conduct disorder, it is articulated and people feel confident doing that.
And what's the benefit if the interventions and the inverted commas treatment isn't any different? What's the benefit? Why are you saying I as a clinician don't fight shy of calling it what it is?
Because one, it's about risk. So whilst, like I say, it's a cluster of behaviors that we give a label to, it helps identify risk. It keeps you asking the question, why did we give the diagnosis? What's changed, if anything? And do we need to think about it?
So is it partly that it can play a preventative role in terms of the risk of falling into that trap of behaviour is due to autism, therefore it's not criminal?
Yes.
I follow. 3.3.1.5, we have it on the screen already. A diagnosis of conduct disorder in the absence of any other condition would have prompted an earlier discharge from community CAM services and a risk assessment considering this would have been supported social care to ensure the need for supervision and monitoring. I just want to ask for your help in relation to this paragraph. What you seem to be saying there is that absent another condition, in fact, understanding AR's situation as being conduct disorder would have led more quickly to CAMS realising actually we are not the best agency for this. This needs to be dealt with by social care and, if necessary, criminal justice system. Have I correctly understood it so far? Yeah. The reference to, in the absence of any other condition, of course, AR came to have an established diagnosis of autism. Does that make a difference?
No, so most young people with autism do not touch CAM services. So the diagnosis of autism and conduct disorder in the absence of any other.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to check with you. So when a diagnosis of conduct disorder and autism, we should read that as,
yes,
in the absence of any other condition. So for AR, in fact, the direction that this may have pushed into was, in fact, perhaps counterintuitively, being discharged earlier from CAM services. Would that be right?
Yes.
But the reason why, again, correct me if I've misunderstood, but the reason why that may in fact have been beneficial was a process of very clear identification of risk,
yes,
and that CAM services were not going to be able to offer interventions that helped with the risk. Yes?
Yes.
Therefore, the ownership of the mitigation of risk would have to sit with others.
Yes.
Rather than AR remaining open to CAMS and other agencies perhaps thinking, well, CAMS are in the lead on trying to mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
And in that sense, would a diagnosis of conduct disorder, even though the CAMS treatment and approach wouldn't necessarily be any different, actually play an important role?
Yes.
And I'm drawing here on your wider experience, and we're going to hear from those from the local authority in the next phase of our evidence. Forgive the blunt question, what are social care meant to then do?
Don't want to speak for my social care colleagues, but you're asking me a direct question. Particularly, I guess, around safeguarding and risk, to think through what measures they would need to put in place with parents and with the young person. So the situation as it was, as I understood it, is AR was a child in need at the time, and hence there was not really the review process that was expected if somebody was on child protection. There were concerns around neglect, etc., but also his own behavior, both in the home and towards professionals, etc., were of concern. I appreciate he didn't threaten or assault any of the clinicians, but the way he presented or some of the connotations around manipulation, etc., were worrying enough, particularly around treatment, etc. And the support from social care, I guess, increasing the monitoring, the review, the engagement with the parents around how they could support AR, asking the questions around risk, because that would have shifted from being a clinical need around his anxiety to the risk need around, is he safe? Is he keeping himself and others safe? Is there anything worrying going around on his phone, on his computer gadgets, etc.? Is there anything else that needs to be done in that situation? And I think having had this open and CAMS rightly so, they did a lot more than they would have done for young people in similar situations. Having that open-endedness meant that those other levels of concern weren't taken, well, I don't know if they were or not, but I'm assuming they weren't taken into consideration by local authority and other services around him.
And in terms of the push of information to law enforcement, would there also be a role in that for CAMS and the local authority to make clear that the local police were aware, against his background of historical risk, that in fact this wasn't a young person for whom there was a mental health reason stroke a mental health excuse, or a young person who was under the care of mental health. The risk interventions needed to be led by the local authority, but if there was criminal conduct, it needed to be tackled and challenged as such.
Yes.
And again, presumably framing it as conduct disorder with autism, but with responsibility for criminal acts, a formulation along those lines that was shared with agencies, would you agree, would in AR's case, for example, have led to a fundamental difference of approach to the March 22 bus incident?
Yes, because I might be wrong with the timelines, but I think a MASH referral was made at that point.
Yes.
And that would have been where this would have hopefully been more robustly picked up.
Thank you. I want to turn to the adequacy of treatment that was provided by AR to CAMS, and if we could just have the lower three quarters of the page expanded slightly, Sarah, if we may. We can see on this page, sorry, can we just take it from 3.3.2 downwards, so a little bit more, bottom three quarters of the page. So we can see now on screen that at 3.3, forgive me, so just everything from 3.3.2 below, so you've got a bold 3.3.2, perfect, thank you. So you say that CAMS primarily focused on symptoms of anxiety and poor sleep, is that right?
Yes.
You say in the next paragraph that the pharmacological treatment recommended was in line with NICE guidance and peer-approved practices.
Yes.
The clinicians were asked about talking therapies, and I think your view is that they would be the first line, but they had been considered, and AR did not engage with them. And family therapy is also an evidence-based approach for young people with anxiety and school refusal and for conduct disorder, and referral to eating disorder services and dietetics when there were concerns around his weight took place.
Yes.
So in relation to those areas, your conclusion at 3.2.6 is, in my opinion, the treatment noted above was adequate for the conditions that were identified by CAMS,
yes.
taking it shortly. Yeah. I'm asked to just explore some aspects of that with you. You will have seen that over the course of the chronology, AR was prescribed propranolol, then sertraline in various dosages, came off sertraline, then tried fluoxetine. He stopped taking that. He restarted on sertraline, various doses again, stopped taking that. And then sertraline and melatonin were prescribed at one stage in combination, and then he stopped taking the sertraline. Do you have any concerns over those various attempts and the titrations of them, particularly in the context where at times he was non-compliant and reported not to be taking them?
I think the protocol of treatment used was what is normally what we would have done. How it was done, or whether it should have been stopped earlier, or when he wasn't engaged, that's harder because it depends on how he or the family are presenting at the time. If it was me, I would have stopped the treatment when he was non-compliant. And I think the clinicians did do that, but there were times when drugs were prescribed when he wasn't met with directly as well. And I would have insisted he needed to see me to ensure that we continued the prescription.
I hope I summarised some of their evidence fairly. I think the psychiatrist considered that for a young person who was not engaging, offering medication, which was at times what he appeared to be seeking, if not demanding, was one of very few means that they had to keep him engaged and to some extent persevering with attempts at medication. My paraphrase, not their direct evidence, but persevering with attempts at medication was part of a benign attempt to keep him engaged and keep some contact. Is that a legitimate consideration for psychiatrists to weigh in this challenging type of presentation?
It often is, but often we expect the young person to either come see us or meet with us when we come visit them, and that would be the minimum.
Yeah. And I think you'll be aware that both were attempted, and quite a number of home visits were attempted, sometimes with AR being seen, but often with him refusing to be seen. But again, is this a legitimate variance in practice? You yourself would have stopped sooner, but I don't think you criticise Drs. Ram or Molyneux for the attempts that they did make in relation to the medication.
No, and I think they made far more attempts to see him in person and visit him at home than most clinicians would.
Were there any contraindications to the prescription of sertraline, risk of anxiety, side effects of it?
No, that's in the first couple of weeks, and then that subsides. It depends on the individual, but that's part of the review process, and some have it more than others, but it wouldn't be a contraindication.
Were there any other pharmaceutical options other than SSRIs that you think that should have been tried?
Not really.
Is there any contraindication to sertraline and melatonin being provided at the same time?
No.
Thank you. Back to your own report then, please, and if we can go over the page, please, Sarah, just noting that the next question you were asked is, to the extent that you identify any inadequacy, the treatments that you consider would have been more appropriate. And then top of page 23. In the absence of a risk assessment that informed the management plan, there was no intervention carried out to review his risk of harm to others with him and his parents, and to consider other management plans, the supervision of his internet use, mental health act assessment, etc. So I think here, if I've understood correctly, what you're driving at is no criticism really of the pharmaceutical interventions, family therapy, eating concerns, but what was missing was an attempt both to review the risk of harm to others and have in place a management plan that tried to mitigate that with AR and with his parents.
Yes, and the wider system, really.
Thank you. Within that, and obviously there's a lot that lies behind this, which we will explore with AR's parents, but would you expect, and would the treating clinicians have been entitled to expect, that AR's parents would seek to assist in keeping some sort of therapeutic relationship going?
As in between AR and the clinicians?
Yeah, that they would be seeking to assist in trying to keep the therapeutic relationship going?
Yes.
And that in doing so, as parents, they would be open and honest about problems they were having?
Yes. However, this is what I would hope for. However, in most cases, that is not what happens.
Yeah. So those treating and assessing risk no doubt have to be on their guard, as would all agencies, for the fact that there may be a natural tendency for parents to underplay the wrongdoing of their children.
Yes.
And also perhaps take into account the risk of embarrassment or shame,
Yes.
which could also influence a lack of disclosure.
Yes.
And in some cases also to be cognizant of the fear that parents may have of their offspring as well.
Yes.
But if, and we need to explore it with them, but if there had been, for example, the delivery of weapons, knives, and other weapons that were known about by parents, would the hope and expectation be that they should reveal that to clinicians, to CAMS?
Well, more than CAMS, I'd have thought they would have picked up the phone to the police. Because nobody from CAMS asked them that question.
Yeah.
So is it okay to expand on that?
Yes, of course.
So I guess, again, I keep going back to the risk assessment, but if you'd done a risk assessment and you'd either got CAMS clinicians or spoken to the parents and the young person yourselves, you'd have been very clear that these are the things we're worried about. For parents, you would have said, X, Y, and Z happens, you need to be in touch with X, Y, and Z. And that would have helped or enabled them. You know, you'd have acknowledged the fact that it's difficult if your child is being assaultive towards you. You'd have openly talked about these things if you were thinking about it. And then that would have enabled, and in most cases it does enable parents to go, actually, I am fearful, I am scared, I am worried about the community around me. And then you'd have different ways of making sure they had a process of alerting. So I think, you know, and this is not to excuse whatever happened. In the first instance, they should have called the police. But to allow for them to bring it up, it should have been thought of to begin with.
Can I just explore one aspect of that with you? If, let's take the case of a knife being delivered to AR, if that was known about by parents, notwithstanding the gravity of that and the risk to others and what might be thought to be the moral imperative to do something about it, to take that as read into my question, isn't it natural for parents to have a reluctance to have the police as the port of call in that situation, because they will feel immediately that it's likely to lead to criminal sanction for their own child?
That is likely, but what reason would they have to tell a CAMS clinician who was only there to look at their child from a point of view of anxiety?
Or social care.
Social care, probably a bit more, but they wouldn't necessarily bring it up to CAMS clinicians. It would be nice if they did, but I don't think that it would be something they definitely would, if that makes sense.
And in terms of thinking about the future and the lessons to be learned, and again, there are issues here that we must explore openly and candidly with AR's parents, but is there an important role here to educate parents in this type of situation that informing the police of a purchase of a knife or carrying a knife may be a very difficult step to take, and may lead to consequences, but those consequences may be less and may be better than the consequences of not reporting it and matters escalating further and the knife being used?
Absolutely.
from the records that you have seen, and we must ask others about it, had that message been given to AR's parents, do you think, in those terms?
Not from the records I've seen.
In terms of the family dynamic, I'm asked to explore with you quite a lengthy range of factors, but just to give some indications, in relation to AR, traits of minimizing his prior actions, evasiveness or unwilling to take responsibility, dishonesty in his own accounts, him being argumentative, driven by a perception of grievance, a lack of reflection, a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy, manipulating professionals or at least demanding medication. And in respect of AR's parents, potentially for them, again, matters must be explored with them, but evidence of them minimizing AR's prior actions, awareness of him having knives on occasions, perhaps not being capable of preventing his behaviors, but also perhaps over-accommodating for him, not setting boundaries. And the family dynamic generally of AR being dominant, the parents perhaps being afraid, unwilling at times to challenge him. That wide range of factors, first of all, important for clinicians to understand the full picture, or as much of that picture as they could, would you
Yes.
agree?
Yes.
And in good practice, would all of that have fed into the standardized risk assessment
Yes.
and inform the management plan and what needed to be both attempted in terms of interventions, but also monitored in terms of risks improving or getting higher?
Yes, absolutely.
I turn then to the decision to discharge AR from CAMS, section 3.3.4 of your report on page 23, please. And if we go to your conclusion on this at the bottom of the page, we've touched on this already in the mental health context, but I think if anything, where you end up on this issue is that it might have been appropriate, is this right, to actually have discharged AR earlier from CAMS than was done.
Yes.
If the diagnosis had been made and the understanding was that actually CAMS were not able to offer effective interventions.
Yes.
Could we have on screen briefly, please, AHCH 30161? The reason given, and again, we allow for the fact that it's a short form summary, may even have been from a drop down, but reason for closure, treatment completed. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment of the reason for closure?
Yes.
Because?
Well, it's pretty much what I've said, but it should have been done earlier. So he continues to struggle with his anxiety, but he wasn't taking treatment, he wasn't engaging with them, and he was happy being where he was. And he hadn't attended sessions. He had been kept open for family intervention, but as I understood it, even that was something he wasn't necessarily attending, and so discharged.
Yeah. So you don't take issue with the structure of this, but presumably what is missing from this is the next steps and the formulation of who should then be taking over in terms of being a lead agency and dealing with the risk.
Yes. But what this doesn't also, so it doesn't really articulate. I mean, it does say here radicalization, knife to school, and attacks on peers. So in the bit, it does mention that. But what it doesn't articulate is when you do a closure letter, you would have all other agencies who continue to be involved in him. So I know there was a transitions team, but they hadn't concluded, et cetera, et cetera. And because he was so close to his 18th birthday, if there was a need or things change, what would the process be?
Yeah. So where services may need to come re-engaged and they may then need to be adult services. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Turn to the next topic that you dealt with in your report, which is the steps taken to re-engage AR in treatment. The middle of page 24, please, Sarah. I think you say there, it's quite brief in your report, not a criticism, but CAMS tried to engage with AR virtually, it's the middle of the page, and in person. They did a home visit, tried seeing him at school. They stopped medication appropriately when they became aware of his non-compliance. Should we take it from that that you don't, in fact, have any criticism of the attempts that were made to re-engage AR?
No.
Thank you. But at the bottom of the page, any other steps which you consider CAMS ought to have taken to assess and or otherwise manage the risk of AR after he disengaged. And then go to the top of the next page. We come back here, 3.4.4.1, whilst it's not common practice to consider a mental health act assessment every time a young person disengages, given AR's historic risks and his presentation or the lack of physical evidence of his presentation in the early half of 2024, that should have prompted a mental health act assessment. And I think that brings us full circle back to the evidence you gave earlier on. Is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you. In addition to that, the quite long list of developments during the course of the chronology, so AR's diagnosis of autism in February 21, but then matters like the second and the third prevent referrals in the spring of 21, the incidence of violence in the home in November 21, and then particularly the bus incident in March 22, May 22, police called again for violence in the home, and then the increasing isolation from September 23. There's a lot of detail that sits behind that, but all of that should have given rise to considerations for re-referral to FCAMS.
Yes, absolutely.
You deal with the adequacy of interagency working in your report, page 25. I can deal, I think, very shortly with this because the agencies to whom this has been put so far have all agreed. At the bottom of page 25, taking it shortly but not overlooking its importance, in my opinion, bottom of the page please Sarah, in my opinion, whilst there were a number of meetings, in the absence of a lead agency, a clear handover process and an appropriate risk assessment, the interagency working arrangements were not adequate. Is
Yes.
that right? And good practice we've touched on in a number of ways, but in terms of looking at interagency working, would you have expected, given the gravity of the risks involved, better attendance at the meetings, trying to send substitutes, sending written contributions if they were not able to attend meetings, yes?
Yes.
And in terms of good practice on this as well, deferring perhaps discharge decisions if important agencies were not at a particular meeting?
Yes. Are you thinking of a particular event where that took place?
Well, I'm thinking in part of FCAMS in March, when CAMS weren't at the meeting, but FCAMS had then closed the case to them at that stage.
I think if there were assumptions made that X agency was going to do something and they weren't present, then I would have expected the meeting to be deferred till the agency could attend.
Thank you. So again, just think about what good practice for multi-agency working would look like. Clear identification at every stage of who is the lead agency, documented and put into effect.
Yes.
Pooling of information at all times, including in relation to risk information.
Yes.
And whether the SAVRI itself or by another form of shared document, each agency would need to have a proper record of the shared key features relating to risk.
So actually, whatever document was produced by whoever should be shared with all the agencies involved in the young person's care.
To ensure that for each agency, if there was changes of staff, handovers, clinicians leaving, case managers leaving, in the real world, of course, you can't always have continuity, but that early information doesn't get lost within each agency.
Absolutely.
Actions clearly identified, who needs to do what, who is going to do it, when it is going to happen, and for those to be realistic and achievable. In other words, smart compliance.
Absolutely.
So far as record keeping is concerned, page 26, Dr. Runner, you refer in some detail there to the internal reviews that have been done, particularly by Alderhay, and you, I think, endorse their own findings that record keeping was not adequate.
Yes.
So I don't need to go through the detail of that. Just want to ask you briefly about one aspect of that, which was the evidence, particularly of Dr. Molyneux, but of Dr. Ram to an extent as well. There was an SOP for the CAM service, which, depending upon how you interpret it, either suggested that the whole of the electronic patient record should have been read, or the entirety, at least since the patient was last seen. And Dr. Molyneux in particular said in relation to that he thought that he had done a reasonable review of the notes, but hadn't gone back through everything, and you wouldn't have time as a clinician to read every line of the notes. In one sense, the difficulty of that is that in the notes, even within the CAMS records, a lot of the incidence and risk information was present, but might be thought to have been scattered throughout the record in different places. First of all, is that a common difficulty and challenge?
It is. Most of our, well, I think there are 3 main electronic systems, and none of them are perfect, but and it's difficult to say the timelines, but most have now developed a risk performer where you'd capture all the risk information, like the new, or at least the 24 document that we saw.
Yeah.
But it is extremely hard for clinicians to go through the extent of all the records. And I agree with that. But what you tend to do is, at least if your system allows for it, search for risk information. You would have a comprehensive, at least an initial assessment document that highlights the risk information so that you can, it's difficult to read through everything, but you can keep that in mind. And I think that was what was lacking at this.
So an important lesson in relation to record keeping is that if the risk information is scattered through what becomes hundreds of pages of records, it creates an inevitable risk of the key headlines being lost. So
Absolutely.
Critical to have a summary that's accessible and visible on whichever software is being used, yes?
Completely.
But important for that to be kept up to date as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. From the reading that you were able to do and your assessment of the records, to what extent did resourcing play a part other than the effects of COVID?
It's really difficult to say because I don't know the actual makeup of the service to its full extent. But from the amount of appointments he had and the clinicians involved, so he had 3 different clinicians involved at the time, I'm not sure that it did have an impact on his case clinically. Whether it had an impact on the clinician's capacity to write notes, make notes, from the lack of, I would make an assumption that it did.
But in fundamental terms, and I'm sorry to raise it in this direct way, but the issues of ensuring that a standardized risk assessment was done and that there was then appropriate multi-agency working, taking that forward, was that really about the jobs being done properly with the resources that were available?
Yes, absolutely. So I don't think that is something that you could say no to. I mean, the daily, how much information you put in on the records, you can put 2 lines or you can put 20 pages. But the risk assessment and attending multi-agency meetings, I don't think either of those should be impacted by resources.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I got the question right. I hope.
No.
Yeah.
Again, putting it bluntly, that a difficulty with resources or being busy is not an excuse for the central failures that you've identified in your report.
Yes. The other thing I just want to say is young people don't need multiple meetings. They need a meeting with good attendance. And I think sometimes we get caught up in having meetings every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. If they don't serve a purpose, they shouldn't really happen till the right people are around the room.
Thank you. I want to come finally to your helpful conclusion sections. Could we start actually with page 31, please, Sarah? Could we have the bottom 3 paragraphs highlighted, please? In the previous sections, you, Dr. Rani, had gone through recommendations and points of learning from Alder Hayes' own report, and you endorsed those, so I'm not going to go through them. But you say that in addition to those recommendations, so that was the context, in my opinion, the following will be useful when multiple agencies are involved with a young person with an autism diagnosis who also presents a risk to others. So firstly, the system ensures that a lead organisation is identified to hold the risk assessment and to ensure that the other agencies are accountable for their actions. Yes?
Yes.
So that's not just about identifying the lead agency, but it's then the lead agency's role in ensuring that other agencies are doing what has rightly been delegated to them.
Yes.
Secondly, a comprehensive structured risk assessment is commissioned when local risk assessments do not fulfil the need.
Yes.
And then top of the next page, please, Sarah. When external agencies like Prevent are referred to, they need to work collaboratively with the agencies involved and share their risk assessment with the wider system and receive feedback from services before concluding their assessment.
Yes.
Now, could you just help from, at least from the records that you've reviewed and the witness statements that you've reviewed, what it was that led you to make that recommendation?
So if I understood this correctly, Prevent closed the case because they felt CAMS was addressing AR's concerns, along with he did not meet criteria for the channel referral. Appreciate that. But that assumption, actually CAMS wasn't dealing with anything that was relevant to the risk at the time. And so I think that if their risk assessment in its totality had been shared with CAMS services, one, it would have helped them recognize the risk, I suspect, and appreciate. And the second bit is CAMS would have been able to come back and say, well, we're not doing any of this. Who else is doing it? Well, that would have raised questions, got people thinking. So I think it's just to assume services are doing something because they're involved with a young person is one of the biggest dangers that we see with cases like AR. But also when complete risk assessments aren't shared, then what happens with services involved with young people is they assume that there is no risk.
And so there is a lot of detail that sits behind this. And so the boldest of summaries may be unfair, but to the extent that there were elements of thinking in the Prevent assessment that they didn't assess that AR was was vulnerable to radicalisation, but also that the behaviours were linked to autism and CAMS were dealing with it and mitigating it, you think that greater discussion with Prevent would have shown the fallacy of the latter part of that thinking?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then on to your conclusions proper, that they're clearly set out, but I should touch on them. So paragraph 4.4.1, your conclusions, each of your sections has got a helpful conclusion previously. So really what you're doing here in the conclusion, paragraph 4.4.1, bottom of the page, is identifying points of key learning for the inquiry. So 4.4.1 and the bottom two paragraphs. First of all, 4.4.1, identifying a lead organisation who holds the risk assessment for the young person and through it holds others accountable for their actions. Yes?
Yes.
Secondly, a structured risk assessment is carried out using a structured professional judgment tool like the SAVRI, which is a structured professional risk assessment tool for violence in young people. And we've looked at why that would have been so important. Do you agree?
Yes.
Then over the page, specialist services like community FCAMs are consulted with who should be supporting the completion of the risk assessments noted above. Just clarify what you mean in that.
Apologies with the sentencing, but I mean, in events such as this, you would want services to consult with forensic CAM services to ensure that the risk assessment is completed or they're supported in completing it. So whilst I do not expect CAM services to have the expertise to do it, some CAMS clinicians are trained in doing specific risk assessments and might want to do it. And in those cases, you'd expect community FCAMs to support them.
Thank you. 4.4.4, you endorse the recommendations on record keeping, but you flag for particular consideration the importance of key clinicians having a clear documented handovers of the young person, the systemic issues and their risk. And is
Yes.
that because you detected that with changeovers and churn of staff, which may be impossible to avoid, there was a degradation of the amount of information and understanding, in particular in relation to risk?
Absolutely.
4.4.5, when a young person disengages and clinicians are worried about risk and safeguarding, due consideration should be given to the Use of a Mental Health Act to assess the young person, yes?
Yes.
And do we add to that possible consideration to whether there's a gap in the legislation?
Absolutely.
4.4.6, a diagnosis of autism does not preclude a young person from being processed through the criminal justice system or be fit to be interviewed and tried and to develop skills to address their risks. I think that brings into play issues about making sure that not only is that recognised, but it's shared with appropriate agencies.
Absolutely.
4.4.7, a diagnosis of autism in someone who does not have a learning disability and is of normal intellect, presumably this should read at least in some cases,
Yeah.
can increase the risks, particularly if the risk is associated with their area of special interest and is accompanied with a lack of empathy.
Yes.
So it's not in all cases of autism, but if they have normal intellect, if they have risky special interests and a lack of empathy, then in that sense, in those individual cases, autism increases risk.
Absolutely.
And people shouldn't be afraid to call that as it is.
Yes.
4.4.8, it would be useful to commission training that's nationally accessible for all statutory bodies, including organisations like Prevent and the police. What did you particularly have in mind there?
It's specifically around this matter around young people with autism and their capacity or ability
I follow.
and the risk.
And then you say one of the factors not referenced in this report would probably be useful for the Chair to consider is the absence of a legislative framework on monitoring the use of the internet by a young person with known risks but no legal premise. And that last one gives rise, finally, to your addendum report, which I'd like to turn to briefly. So DRI 502, please, Sarah, and if we can pick it up at page 3. you say in paragraph 1.2 that currently there's no legislative framework that supports professionals monitoring what young people view online in their homes unless a young person has been charged, and this is part of either their bail conditions or sentencing conditions, or is part of a safeguarding requirements of part of child protection concerns. In most instances, it's mainly the parents that this is relied on. Then 1.3, you point to the obvious point that youngsters are more savvy generally with tech and the internet than their parents, and they're also adept at clearing browser histories using hidden apps or other functions. And in particular, VPNs, would you agree, which can hide the location and the identity such that age-inappropriate material might still be accessed even with the Online Harms Act, Online Safety Act. And so 1.4, you said, in my opinion, there needs to be specific training identified nationally that is deliverable to all parents. In cases where there are specific safeguarding or risk concerns, then the chair might want to consider what legal framework could support professionals monitoring and supervising internet access by young people in their homes. 1.5, if a young person withdraws from education and as a result has regular welfare checks, could this be something that would fit within their role, and what framework could be used to support them with this? You raise for consideration. And then 1.6, if a young person has diagnosis of autism and has shown a special interest that involves the internet and this is of nature that's safeguarding or risk concern, all professionals involved should have a healthy curiosity of their internet use and have training on how they might challenge and address it. And the chair might want to consider the above with lead agencies that are likely to be working with young people to ensure that there is a standardised training package. So, first of all, from that, in this type of case, those working with those with autism who are higher risk because they have a fascination with violence and may have conduct disorder as well, you would be seeking to put much higher up in the consciousness of professionals dealing the dangers of the internet, and ensuring that that is firmly on the agenda in interventions, yes? And if, before getting on to legislative change, if consent is not forthcoming in relation to that, that of itself would be an indication of greater concern.
Yes.
Similarly, if steps can be put in place with appropriate tools to have monitoring, that may be something that in itself would mitigate the risk and at least would show that it's not increasing, at least in relation to the use of the internet in the home.
Yes.
In relation to parents, presumably one needs to start thinking about both training and tools. So training parents, but also having tools that would be available. So within certainly a local network in the home that would flag up if VPNs are being used, or would give parents the software and the tools to have full oversight of what their children are doing online, beyond simple parental controls.
Absolutely.
And then thirdly, the consideration of whether there should be a legislative change that would allow, in appropriate cases, subject obviously to many civil liberty considerations, but at least give consideration to whether there need to be compulsive powers to include monitoring of what young people who are have a fascination with violence might be doing online.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add to those matters?
No, not really. I guess the bit that, this is only latterly, having had this conversation now, where you have got the deprivation of liberty safeguards, but I think we just have to be cautious when we are thinking about legislative frameworks around civil liberty and how we kind of do it. And it is really complex, but I can't think of any other way of doing it with these young people.
Thank you. There were a number of questions I've sought to cover. I'm just looking to my left. Mr. Bain. I think just Mr. Bain.
No more than 10 minutes, Mr. Byrne, and no repetition, please. Thank you.
I ask questions on behalf of the bereaved families. I want to cover 2/3 topics with you. First, some questions about child protection, then very quickly secure accommodation, and then one very quick addendum about conduct disorders. You were asked by Mr. Moss and dealt very quickly with the possibility of what he called higher level interventions by the local authority. What we all know and what you'll know from your reading is that AR was always treated as a Section 17 case. You know what I mean by that? Child in need. They didn't carry out a Section 47. They didn't grapple with the question of significant harm, and that's just what I want your view on. Would you agree that given the conduct of the boy in October 2019, which we all know about, active homicidal ideation, specific victim identified, etc., and then actually going equipped with a view to kill, that the lack of grappling with the boy in the context of significant harm and Section 47 is something that's, to put it mildly, a little surprising?
I don't want to talk on behalf of my social work colleagues, and I don't know whether I should be. I think they initiated a Section 47 assessment and decided not to proceed with it, as far as I remember the records.
Could I just, well, I mean, we can deal with that in due course, but there was certainly a question of whether they should do, and then they decided after a meeting that it wasn't appropriate.
Yes.
So it then became a Section 17 assessment. Yeah. Okay. What I want to know is not to go through whether that was the right decision or not, but given what had happened to him during that period, and thereafter what happened to him post withdrawal, effectively, from personal attendance at Acorns, and the withdrawal that you've talked about in the isolation. Was he suffering at that stage, because of what was happening to him, significant harm? And before you answer it, the reason I'm asking you the question is all about threshold criteria under Section 31(2) of the Children Act.
Is that for secure comment?
Well, no, that's to open the gateway towards child protection conferences, or you can't make an order.
To be honest, it'll be difficult for me to say at this stage with regards to that particular point, because he was being seen by the youth offending services and he was engaging with them at the time. So even though he presented with the risks, there was an element of engagement through that process. So at that time...
Yeah, that I accept. I mean, the 1747 question is more the context of what I'm driving at. What I'm driving at here is whether or not, on a day-to-day basis, given the gross dysfunction in his life, he was a child either who had suffered significant harm or where there was a likelihood of him suffering significant harm.
It is hard for me to speak for social services at the time, but if agencies altogether had pushed for an assessment to be concluded, then I think that would have moved forward with it. Sorry, I don't want to labour the point, but I accept that. But what you're not answering at the moment is whether, it's a sort of fact, it's a judgment call. Yes.
And there must be a medical element to it, that somebody who is that isolated at home in the context of what he had done in October and December, is that somebody who had suffered or was likely to have suffered himself significant harm?
They should have had the question around it. They should have asked the question at least.
Yeah, okay, all right. Okay.
There are more appropriate witnesses for this issue. It can be put.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay.
Halfway, Mr. Byrne.
Yeah, okay. In relation to any harm that he may have caused to somebody else, so if he causes damage, attacks somebody else, would that then, do you have a medical, psychiatric view on whether or not that effect on him of attacking somebody else would cause him harm?
That would have required a different sort of assessment to determine that. From what I have read, it would not appear that the incidents carried out right before his referral to CAMS had a negative impact on him. Having said that, I don't think that was assessed necessarily in its totality.
They didn't look at it. Okay, thank you. Just secure accommodation. I mean, the simple test for a secure accommodation order is whether he's likely to injure himself or others. Section 25 of the Children Act. Are you surprised, just looking at the chronology in toto, that this boy, that there wasn't any serious consideration of that as an outcome?
I'm not surprised. I don't think secure accommodation would have crossed my mind at all at any point with him. There are young people with higher levels of risk to yourself and others in an acute sense where you couldn't get a secure accommodation order if you wanted. So in his case, even less likely.
Okay. All right, so that's not really an avenue that would help. Okay.
Wouldn't go down.
And in terms of if the child protection process had begun through 47 and what follows, Child Protection Conference, would the natural lead agency then have been child protection?
Yes.
They would have glued everything together with all of the other agencies?
Yes.
Right, okay. And finally, sir, conduct disorders, I just want to ask you this. Early intervention, once it's diagnosed, is really important.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's that early intervention which is the key to ameliorating the problems that he has with his personality.
Yes.
Correct? And would it also then serve as a flag to other people who interacted with him during the course of the next few years?
Yes, I guess I've highlighted that earlier.
Thank you. I hope the bell has not gone. That's all I have for this witness.
It hasn't, Mr. Byrne. Thank you very
you.
much. Dr. Ronnie, just one thing from me. Mr. Moss has asked you really whether there may be need for some kind of legislative intervention so as to give greater powers in the right situation for things like internet control, the ability of clinicians to walk up the stairs and knock on the bedroom door, to insist on various things. I'm going to have to obviously reflect on that generally, but one thing while you were giving your evidence that did occur to me is, given your emphasis on the importance of having a proper management plan in place, to which there has been contribution by all of the right agencies, almost undoubtedly, I would have thought, following the completion of a standardized risk assessment, would those involved in the formulation of the management plan probably be the people best placed to identify whether some element of, and I'm going to use the word compulsion, but you understand what I mean, whether some element of compulsion ought at least to be available in carrying the management plan out and thereby reducing the element of risk?
Yes.
Right.
And that would be, hence the comment on all the organisations coming together to pull this.
As it seemed to me, that probably, if it's done correctly, is the forum at which you're going to have the best input and the best chance of understanding what is really needed.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Dr. Rana, you've put an enormous amount of work into this. You have given incredibly clear evidence, which has been of vast assistance to me, and I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
You're now free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moss, I think I'm right in thinking that we have now reached the stage when, regrettably, Miss Wakeman will be leaving us. And that is in order, not because she's abandoning ship for discreditable reasons, but because she's going on maternity leave.
So yes.
I want to acknowledge the truly impressive contribution she has made to preparing for the hearings and her contribution to the process of calling evidence. She joined us at very short notice, and I'm profoundly grateful for her unstinting hard work. So you leave, Ms. Wakeman, with my sincere thanks.
So you will know how much I wish to echo that. So I don't think it's appropriate to start our next witness. May I suggest 140?
1:40. I'll sit again at 1:40.